My name is Thomas Bell, and I'm an assistant professor of political science and the pre-law advisor here at Knox. And it's my distinct privilege to welcome you to this year's annual Constitution Day lecture. Constitution Day is observed each year on September 17th in commemoration of the adoption of the US Constitution in 1787 and in recognition of those who've become US citizens. The law establishing this federal observance was part of the Omnibus Spending Bill of 2004 and mandates that all publicly funded educational institutions provide educational programming on the history of the American Constitution on this day or during the week of September 17th. It goes without saying that our constitutional order seems to be in crisis today on almost every observable dimension. Certainly, this crisis extends to very real questions of leadership and the ability of our institutions to meet the task of modern governance amid growing division and distrust among the citizenry. Also troubling, though, are questions about the justice of our constitutional enterprise. While such questions have been perennial throughout the history of American constitutionalism, they are particularly acute and no less urgent today, as evidenced by the killing of George Floyd earlier this summer as yet another instance of police brutality against people of color. None of this larger context we find ourselves in today is lost on anyone here, I imagine. And it's in this context that we invite Professor Melvin Rogers to speak to us about democratic faith in dark times, the title of his lecture. And so rather than step on what Professor Rogers has to say, let me go ahead and introduce him now and invite him to begin his lecture. But before doing that, let me just give a quick word on the format of today's lecture. Professor Rogers will deliver about a 30 to 35 minute lecture, and that will be followed by a Q&A session. The way this works on Zoom is that if you raise your hand, I can unmute you so that you can ask your question to Professor Rogers. And so I will try and work through and see your hand raised as quickly as I can so that, that you're able to ask your question. And so let me introduce Professor Rogers to you now. Professor Melvin L. Rogers is an associate professor of political science at Brown University and the director of graduate studies for the political science department. He's the author of the Undiscovered Dewey, Religion, Morality, and the Ethos of Democracy with Columbia University Press, and co-editor of African American Political Thought, A Collected History, forthcoming later this year with the University of Chicago Press. Professor Rogers is currently working on a book project titled The Darkened Light of Faith, Race, Democracy, and Freedom in African American Political Thought, forthcoming with Princeton University Press. Professor Rogers' articles have appeared in major academic journals, as well as popular venues such as Dissent, The Atlantic, and the Boston Review. And he serves as co-editor of the New Histories of Philosophy series at Oxford University Press. And so, Professor Rogers, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you today on behalf of the entire Knox community. And so without further ado, everyone, welcome Professor Rogers to Knox College. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Tom, can you hear me? I just want to make okay, great. So I just want to say thank you, Tom, for inviting me. I'm delighted that you are all here. And I wish I could be there, obviously, in person. I wish we could be together as we talk about some of these very important topics I'm going to put on the table today. But I'm delighted all the same to be here, even if virtually. So let me just say to you, there are no slides here. I have a lecture here, a presentation that I will work through. And my sense is that if you journey with me, if you walk with me, we should be able to find our way just fine, okay? So the title of the talk today is Democratic Faith in Dark Times. In Dark Water of 1920, a great and important figure, W.B. Du Bois, offers an incisive commentary on the meaning of democracy. And against those who would restrict the franchise, Du Bois offered the following. Quote, such arguments so so curious a misapprehension of the foundation of the argument for democracy that the argument for it must be continually restated and emphasized. Now, this statement is arresting, particularly in the time in which Du Bois is writing. These words were penned by an African-American in the 1920s, at the time when the insecurity of Black life was constantly on display, a period in which, despite the Civil War amendments, Black people were reminded again and again of how fragile life was. Jim and Jane Crow was the law of the land, and Black life could be extinguished, disposed of with impunity. Du Bois's idea of restating the argument for democracy, that is, it must be restated, as he says, raises an important question that haunts the struggle for racial equality, and indeed the legitimacy of American politics. What is it about democracy that justifies our faith, especially the faith of African Americans in it? Given the frequency with which African Americans are killed by police, the ongoing problems of economic inequality they experience, and the general sense that from city to city and state to state, Black people are subject to a fundamental insecurity, not chiefly of their own making, it is difficult to suggest that commitment is or has been justified at all. And it may, in fact, seem more appropriate to interpret the United States as working according to plan, connecting the horror of the earliest periods of African-American life to the present moment in one story about the nation's presumed foundational commitment to anti-Blackness. Writing, for example, in response to the 2012 killing of Trayvon Martin, journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates describes Martin's killing as the natural consequence of the functioning of American society. This is what he writes. When you have a society that takes at its founding the hatred and degradation of a people, when the society is inscribed with that degradation in its hallowed documents, and continues to inscribe hatred in its laws and policies, it is fantastic to believe that its citizens will derive no ill messaging. It is painful to say this. Trayvon Martin is not a miscarriage of justice, but American justice itself. This is not our system malfunctioning. It is our system working as intended. Little can be denied in this, and we might add other voices who are trying to get us to see that anti-Blackness functions as a precondition for American progress and development. And it is fashionable these days, and understandably so, to wear one's pessimism on one's sleeve. And if we are honest with ourselves, how could we do otherwise? Moments of hope have often been dashed by the cold and cruel reality of American life. And it is no wonder we find it hard to stabilize our faith in a racially just society. And so here in brief is a sample of this history. In the wake of Black Americans' participation in the American Revolution, the nation witnessed a slow denial of their standing and contribution to political society. With the ongoing development of slavery in the South, northern states in the 19th century slowly rescinded rights that had previously been extended to African Americans. Although the Civil War amendments sought to recognize the equal status of Blacks, that recognition was effectively denied by the ascendancy of debt peonage, economic exploitation, lynching, and Jim and Jane Crow. The Civil Rights Movement seemingly killed Jim and Jane Crow, but the policing and subordination of Blacks was reconstituted through the rise of the carceral state, the underdeveloped welfare system, and the underfunded public education system that has been exacerbated by residential segregation. Whatever one might think of his success, the fact remains that the election of the first Black president has been followed by Donald Trump, who defines his success based on removing any trace of its previous occupant. Trump's success was, without exaggeration, cultivated through the tropes of white supremacy, nativism, and the commitment to police Black and brown populations. Now, at precisely this moment, I think we must confront some important questions. Is American democracy constitutionally at odds with our goals? Or might it be conducive to building a society in which we all can live equally and at peace with one another? Are there normative resources on which one can rely to advance an affirmative claim, a positive claim regarding racial equality? Or must the resources of modern democracy remain forever premised on anti-Blackness? Now, admittedly, these appear to be empirical questions that depend on history, or do they? In our historical calculus, we might emphasize the reconstitution of white supremacy, but we could just as easily emphasize the ways in which it has been foiled through multiple waves of racial inclusion. Now, those who embrace the former as our true racial reality find themselves trying to prove to those of us who have benefited from racial struggle why our success is illusory or at best temporary. But those who locate America's identity in its resistance to white supremacy have another problem. They often are unable to see the evidence of systemic racism, or they readily describe it as anomalous, foreign to the structure of American life. If the first posture seems unsatisfying because it denies to us human agency and gives the past too much power over the present and future, the second risks turning a blind eye to the ways white supremacy is often bolstered by institutional support and state-sanctioned violence that emanates from a culture that disregards the standing of Black people. Both sides, I think, fail to distinguish between the somewhat different task of studying the past and narrativizing the past in a way that is useful for moving society in an auspicious direction. And in Frederick Douglass's felicitous formulation of the matter, quote, "We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and to the future." That statement, those words, come from Frederick Douglass' famous 1852 address, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." And in that address, he does not dismiss the past. Rather, he stands in a line of thinkers who see in America's past a vital principle that is both visionary and realistic. Similar to early 19th century abolitionists, say, for example, David Walker, and very much consistent with those that would come after him, say, for example, James Baldwin, Douglass deploys the principle of making and remaking that underwrites American society, what we call sometimes the constituent power of the people. The idea of the people, Douglass knows all too well, forms part of the tradition of American life, sitting alongside, to be sure, but sitting alongside and often used to combat the white supremacist tendencies of the American tradition. And Douglass retrieves this principle from the past, and he counsels his fellows to place it in the service of the present and the future. Douglass, African Americans may often be alienated from American society, but they are not alien to it. And this point is of great significance when you consider the thread running through much of African American thinking and struggle that seeks to make American society a racially just one. They see and have seen, that is African Americans, their efforts as emerging from within and forming part of the very complex tradition of America's moral and political language. Like them, Douglass's aim is to emphasize those portions of the tradition that might yet deepen and extend democracy against those other portions that will constrain democracy's meaning and reach. The meaning of America, its past and its future, is for Douglass something over which to struggle. But he sees struggle as an emergent property, a developing property of the contested notion of who comprises the people, of who comprises the idea of the people that is otherwise so central to democracy. So the question of what America really is defies articulation, even as we struggle to say something substantive about our ethical and political identity. And this is simply because we cannot get on with figuring out where we should go and who we ought to become without narrating the past to which we belong. But worrying too much, and this is Douglas's point, but worrying too much about offering the true description or final narrative of that past may miss the point. We ask questions of the past: who are we really? Less to understand our identity once and for all, and more to aid us in making decisions about who we should become. This is, I want to suggest to you, this is the aspirational quality of the American imagination. Indeed, the aspirational core on which African Americans have often relied to make sense of their appeals, their constant appeals to the nation. This is, I also think, and want to suggest to you, the perfectionist or romantic register on which many in this tradition have often worked, including Douglas himself. So I want to spend some more time trying to retrieve this meaning and this complex power, the complex power of this aspirational view, believing that it is in moments such as this one, these dark moments, that we need to recall the faith of those that came before. But just as we have in our current moment powerful reasons to lose faith, Douglas had in his time a powerful alternative to his own vision. And that alternative is found in the figure of Martin Delaney. Martin Delaney was Douglas's once co-editor, and Martin Delaney is arguably understood to be the founder of Black nationalism. So I want to spend some time with Douglas and Delaney, first with Delaney, and then I want to try to turn to what emerges in their discussion, the discussion around hope and faith that we will see that emerges between Delaney and Douglas, and how they think very differently about the political foundations of American life. And I want to try to see what we can learn, if there's anything to learn, from this disagreement between these two very important figures. So we begin with Martin Delaney. On the evening of December 13th, 1850, the faculty of Harvard's medical school met at the house of then Dean Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. to discuss various petitions. And these petitions were about the admission of 3 African Americans and 1 woman to the school. Now, Holmes had already admitted these students, and the men would be allowed to remain for a semester. The woman had already withdrawn. But it was ultimately, and here is a quote, deemed inexpedient after the present course to admit colored students to attendance on medical lectures, end quote. Explaining his position, given that Holmes had already admitted these people and they were already in attendance, but explaining his position, Holmes said in a letter of 1850, the faculty is now convinced, quote, that the intermixing of the white and black races in their lecture rooms is distasteful to a large portion of the class and injurious to the interests of the school, end quote. I mean, Holmes was expressing and affirming views articulated in an earlier resolution that was passed by a majority of the students. Martin Delaney, one of the 4 admitted students, left Harvard Medical School in March of 1851, and he was not permitted to return. Only a few months earlier, in September of 1850, the United States Congress passed the Draconian Fugitive Slave Act, an act that strengthened the earlier 1793 version. And in response to the 1793 law, states such as Indiana and Connecticut made the right of jury trials upon appeal possible for escaped slaves, while states such as Vermont and New York provided slaves with attorneys, and they made the jury trial a legal right. The 1850 law, seeing those holes, essentially destroyed all possibilities to aid escaped slaves, effectively denying the standing of slaves, even in free states. And it also provided harsh penalties for those who violated the law. Now, in Delaney's mind, these two, him being asked to leave Harvard and the fugitive slave law, they mingle together in his mind. They each were of a piece. They each were connected to a general logic of seeing African Americans as an inferior race. And in response to this, Delaney argues for immigration. In his signature text, The Condition, Elevation, Immigration, and Destiny of the Colored People of the United States, published in April of 1852, represents a powerful indictment of American life. Delaney's argument for immigration emanates from a belief that the ethos of American society, or what we might call culture, depends on the domination of Black Americans. This is what he means, for example, when he says, to quote him, "We are politically," referring to Black Americans, "we are politically not of them, but aliens to the laws and political privileges of the country. These are truths, fixed facts, that quaint theory and exhausted moralizing fall harmlessly before." There's something else at work in Delaney's analysis in that book, which I'll just simply refer to as condition. Political life, Delaney thinks, is merely the attitudinal expression of the underlying culture of society. This is what he writes. Among the whites, their color is made by law and custom the mark of distinction and superiority, while the color of the Blacks is a badge of degradation acknowledged by statute, organic law, and the common consent of the people. With this view of the matter, which we hold to be correct, to elevate the equality of the degraded subject by law and custom, it can only be done by an entire destruction of the identity of the former condition of the applicant. Now, by identity here, Delaney has in mind the identity that is ascribed to African Americans by virtue of their race, what he calls the badge of degradation that is instantiated in the political, legal, and cultural life of American society. The identity of white Americans comes about, or so Delaney suggests, by virtue of this contrast with their darker counterparts. To overcome the condition requires that one destroy the badge of degradation, but this also involves significantly a willingness by white Americans to destroy the legal and customary badge of superiority they now flaunt. They must be willing, in Delaney's estimation, to destroy who they take themselves to be. And this would mean, in Delaney's estimation, the overthrow of American life. Now, Delaney connects culture and politics together in a way, I think, that continues to haunt American society. He wants his readers to think that there is no meaningful distinction between, as I said earlier, the constituent power of the American people, right, and the constituted form of their power. And he wants his readers to believe that the people's cultural identity and its political identity cannot be separated or transformed. And in fact, for Delaney, the idea of the American people is found in its constitutional order and form. That is to say that the Constitution, the laws that are on the books, are expressive. They're the material expression of the underlying commitments of the society. This way of proceeding is what allows Delaney in 1852 to view the Fugitive Slave Act as he does. And I don't think it's inappropriate. It is what allows Coates, Ta-Nehisi Coates that I cited at the very beginning, to see the killing of Trayvon Martin as he does. And this is what he writes. Trayvon Martin is not a miscarriage of justice, but American justice itself. This is not our system malfunctioning, it is our system working as intended. And this language of working as intended is what connects to Delaney's idea that the constitutional structure of the society expresses the commitments of the nation, and those commitments are fundamentally founded on anti-Blackness. Delaney's view opens an important disagreement between himself and Douglas. And as I said, he and Douglas served as co-editors, and Delaney's earlier writings from the 1840s were much closer to Douglas's position. The story about them sort of falling apart, as it were, is a bit more complicated, but for the moment, let's just sort of stick with this short version. And we see an important disagreement between these two figures. And here is what Delaney says of his position to William Lloyd Garrison, the great abolitionist, in 1852. Quote, "I'm not in favor of caste," this is Delaney speaking, "nor a separation of the brotherhood of mankind, and would as willingly live among white men as Black if I had an equal possession and enjoyment of privilege. Blind selfishness on the one hand and deep prejudice on the other will not permit them to understand that we," so them referring to whites, "understand that we, Blacks, desire the exercise and enjoyment of rights. If there were any probability, hold on to that word. If there were any probability, I should be willing to remain in the country fighting and struggling on, but I must admit that I have no hopes in this country, no confidence in the American people." Douglas responds a year later to this sentiment. Here is Douglas. "We don't object to the colonizationists because they desire the prosperity of Liberia." This was one of the places on the table for Black people to go to. "But it is because, like Brother Delaney, they have not sufficient faith in the people of the United States to believe that the Black man could ever get justice at their hands on American soil." There are two themes I would like to highlight from these passages that I will say more about in a moment. The first is the slide from hope in Delaney to faith in Douglas. The second bears on the invocation of the people found in Douglas's passage. So let me take each of these in turn. The language of hope and faith, right? These are not synonyms. Hope, as philosopher Patrick Shade notes, is, quote, "an active commitment to the desirability and realizability of a certain end," end quote. And it appears for Delaney that hope is tied to confidence in bringing to fruition what one desires. As he suggests, hope stands in the world of probabilities, informed by facts that provide indications of what's possible. "We must abandon," he says, "all vague theory and look at the facts as they really are, viewing ourselves and our true political position in a body politic. The facts do not suggest that it is probable that this nation will change." But Delaney takes those facts, at least in 1852, to be exhaustive not only of what is, but what may be. Now, in contrast to hope, faith is a passionate conviction coterminous with a vision of life or object not in existence. So both hope and faith are tied to something not yet in existence, but the source of difference between the two is that hope marks levels of confidence in achieving what is desired, while faith is the expression of a loving, even if difficult commitment, precisely because there is no confidence to be had, at least based on some facts of the matter, in its realization. And this at least appears to be one way in which these terms, hope and faith, come together. Delaney not only dispenses with hope because there is no evidence to sustain it, but more significantly, he is without faith that there is a narrative of American and African American life that can provoke whites to change, white Americans to change, to dispense with the status they seemingly enjoy by virtue of being white. Now, in contrast, all Douglass has, all he has is faith. In his 1852 address, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, Douglass holds fast to the idea that he can put the revolutionary spirit of 1776 in the service of a racially just society that has never before existed. He thinks that inhabiting the revolutionary spirit and putting it in the service of a racially just society will be so compelling that his fellows will want to take it up. And he holds fast to this idea. He holds fast to this idea even as he states the following. Here is Douglass. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds itself to be false to the future. This declaration should not be taken too far, since the rhetorical context is that Douglass often declares things to be the case as a means to stimulate alternative options, to get people to act. Still, he says it. Now, admittedly, sometimes it is Douglass's religious commitments at work informing his faith. Writing, for example, in the wake of the Dred Scott decision of 1857, he tells us that Justice Taney, quote, may decide and decide again, but he cannot reverse the decision of the Most High. He cannot change the essential nature of things, making evil good and good evil. Other times, it is Douglass's vision of human nature that underwrites his faith. Quote, while man is constantly liable to be evil, he tells us in 1851, he is still capable of apprehending and pursuing that which is good. But more consistently, I think, it is faith in a specific idea of America. Whatever is hoped for seems to have no other ground than this idea itself. Returning to his 4th of July address, he writes, I therefore leave off where I began, with hope, while drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, end quote. And he repeats this sentiment in Dred Scott of 1857. For Douglass, hope and faith come together in a way similar to Hebrews 11:1. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. How then ought we to understand or think about Douglass's idea of faith? As I read him, for Douglass, faith involves committing oneself to a vision of life, what Americans fail to be true to, as he says, that is at odds with the empirical reality of society, but for which one is willing to struggle for. Faith exists in excess of the facts needed to sustain it. Now, this view marks, I think, an important difference between Delaney and Douglass. And I think between those who, let's say, are pessimists regarding racial transformation and those who, let's say, are keepers of the faith. Delaney treats the facts of racial domination as capturing the world as it really is in itself. He thinks those facts are expressive of a deeper historical logic that is merely playing itself out in the United States. As he writes in Condition, quote, that there have been in all ages and in all countries, this is Martin Delaney, that there have been in all ages and all countries classes of people who have been deprived of equal privileges. These are historical facts that cannot be controverted. Now take note here, Delaney does not merely provide us with a description of the past and this invocation of historical facts. Rather, he subsumes history under nature, thus, to invoke a philosophical term, thus ontologizing history as the ultimate ground of human existence. The facts cannot be controverted because they define the temporal fields of the past, the present, and the future. And history becomes that vehicle, or it becomes that framework on which we see the fundamental and immovable traits of human nature display itself. And so much here for human agency. Douglas rejects this kind of thinking. He refuses to remove the human elements from the facts of American history. And he thinks that since the human element isn't the kind of thing that is fixed once and for all, there is no reason to think that the future need only be a replication of the past. To recall a line cited earlier from his 1851 essay, Is Civil Government Right? Quote, while man is constantly liable to do evil, he is still capable of apprehending and pursuing that which is good. Douglas was not alone here. There were others. Anna Julia Cooper, the great Black feminist, and the other American pragmatists, for example, defended this account of faith and defended a similar account of human nature. And its importance is heightened in dark times and explains why Douglas's faith is so very important and even important in our own time. So Anna Julia Cooper tells us that faith is neither a proper interpretive enterprise of scripture nor a process of stabilizing theological certainties. She was religious, but she was uninterested in having the logic of faith confined to religion. As she argues in A Voice from the South of 1892, faith involves submitting oneself to a vision of life that one projects into a world that is at odds with that vision and for which one is willing to act in the service of. And of course, we hear echoes of this in someone like William James. And this is why, to invoke another figure, the sort of American educator and defender of democracy, John Dewey, this is why John Dewey insisted, as late as the 1930s, that there is a difference between, quote, belief that is a conviction that some end should be supreme over conduct, and belief that some object exists as truth for the intellect. And by this, Dewey explicitly intended, and this is what Douglas has in mind, to treat certain kinds of beliefs as imaginative projections, as imaginative possibilities that political actors believe ought to organize their lives and the lives of their fellows, and in which one invests energy. But in seeking, and here's the point, in seeking to convert one's faith into a matter of intellectual assent, a feature of political reality here and now, think, for example, of Delaney, we often reject faith as a precondition for political engagement in the first place. In thinking about faith in this way, I do not mean to suggest that faith isn't disciplined and that it isn't humbled by its encounters with the realities in which it is located. You know, faith talk is often assumed to be a species of irrational thinking. But I tend to think that this way of understanding the matter is mistaken precisely because it does not take seriously how faith is often disciplined by its context. And it is disciplined because the vision of life faith holders offer is often distilled from the bits and pieces of the social and political community's language and ways of existing. And they take those bits and pieces and they reconfigure them and unify them and project them forward into a new configuration of society. African-American thinkers and activists, it seems to me, who stand with Douglas often organize the language of struggle and resistance in such a way, right? In such a way that reconfigures the old and reconfigures it in a novel way. And in reconfiguring it in a novel way, it discloses new meanings, new ways of relating to each other, new ways of organizing political society. So there's three examples here, quick examples I want to give you. Black people, for example, have reworked the meaning of freedom. So for example, in the hands of the American colonists, the struggle with the British Crown was a struggle over the fact that British Americans were denied political standing that they previously had. They were denied political standing they previously had. For Black people, say in the early 19th century, to be free was not merely about having political standing, it included that, but belonging to a culture in which you were believed to be fit for freedom in the first place. So now freedom talk for Black people is not merely about political standing, but a culture of support to realize freedom. In other words, that the meaning of freedom itself is dependent, right, on a community of support for its realization. And this enabled some of them to see that addressing the condition of Black people in the United States would take more than legal and political changes, but would involve and would require a deep transformation of the culture, a culture in which negative and debilitating images of Black people and their capacities otherwise circulated. David Walker, a 19th century abolitionist, engaged in this reworking when he appealed to the very capacity of judgment. Judgment, he believed, comes before and is not dependent on constitutional recognition. And he believed that this capacity to judge was in fact the true source of one's political standing. So that one's capacity to judge, rather than constitutional recognition, was the hallmark of what it meant to be a citizen. He was not only calling Black people to see themselves in a certain light, but he was also reminding his white counterparts that they too appealed to this capacity when they contested the British crown. And so he was encouraging his audience to think of political standing as not, in the final analysis, something that depends on constitutional affirmation, but as an outgrowth of our basic capacity to judge. And Martin Luther King, to use an example we all like to use for different political ends, but Martin Luther King Jr. famously engaged in this reworking of language when he retells the story, and we know this, when he retells the story of the founders and when he makes Black folks part of the intended heirs of the ethical and political goods of the Declaration. He knows that wasn't true. Right? In each instance, these figures were imagining against the tide, confronting a world at variance with their vision, but nonetheless committed to the power of the new language they were offering. And although the imagination is at work among these faith holders, the resources of the imagination are not imaginary. And to stick with the examples above, ideas of freedom and judgment and the founders were already active within the culture, even as their meanings were recast to disclose new ways of seeing, perceiving, and organizing ourselves. And so in this regard, faith is a reality for the faith holder. It orients them in space and moves them through time, influencing their ethical and political choices. And this is why, famously, Ralph Waldo Emerson tells us in 1838 that faith makes us, not we it, and faith makes its own forms. Faith holders only long for the rest of their fellows to see its worth, its significance, and its contribution to human flourishing. Faith is then a species of perfectionism, since the reworking of the language and the new vision of life imagined is put in place to enable, once again, what Emerson calls ascension, or the passage of the soul into higher forms. Right? That's the idea of perfectionism, the sort of passage of self and society into new forms. But the actions of the faith holders are also humbled by the fact that what they offer is dependent on those of whom they do not control, and yet on whose actions they depend. And this is partly why Douglass worked so hard in that 4th of July address to shame and ridicule his audience. If you haven't read it, you got to go read it. And he's shaming and ridiculing them, trying to move them to a position of moral rectitude. And this is why King often uses America's love affair with the founders as a way of eliciting from them something the founders never intended or imagined. So he tells that story about Black people being the heirs to the Declaration, in part because he knows that Americans have a love affair with the founders and want to be thought, or they want to see themselves as in line with the founders. And now here they are out of step with the founders. Precisely because figures like Douglass and King are appealing to those over whom they don't exercise final control, their stance is defined by humility, right? Appealing to their fellows, trying to transform them. So let me come on to this last point, the idea of the people. I've talked a lot about hope and faith. When Douglas appeals to the revolutionary spirit of 1776, he is appealing to the logic of democratic legitimacy that is itself dependent on the idea of openness. Now, legitimacy is not a way of talking about one's adherence to a de facto polity, a polity already in existence, but a way of marking the principle of revision and invention that can connect the polity to what it, right, connect the polity as it is to what it may be. And connect the polity as it is to what it may be within the same background horizon of norms with which citizens are familiar. Douglas is thus asking his fellows to channel the spirit of 76 so as to give life to a vision of themselves not yet in existence. And he is treating the people as not that thing finally specified by the Constitution in Delaney's sense, but as an aspiration struggling to inhabit the world. It is not, he explains in 1857, in changing the dead form of the Union that slavery is to be abolished in the country. Rather, it is in changing ourselves. Slavery lives in this country not because of any paper constitution, but in the moral blindness of American people who persuade themselves that they are safe, though the rights of others may be struck down. And Delaney might enter here and go, aren't they still persuading themselves of that? So with some modifications to the language, we could very well speak this sentiment today, both that of Delaney and Douglas. But both in the 1852 4th of July address and 1857 engagement with Dred Scott decision, Douglas is asking his fellows to become the vision of themselves he imagines. And they can do so by using the principle of openness deployed by the American founders as they resisted the British crown and as they remade themselves into what is called the United States. When Douglas makes this move, he is refusing to concede ground on what this fragile experiment called American democracy is and who comprises it. And there is insight here. I am often struck by claims that white supremacy is fundamental to the American polity and that anti-Blackness defines America. I'm struck not because these things are not true, they are true. I'm struck because these truths are often presented as exhausting the tradition we find ourselves living. But when you accept these claims about what America really is, struggles against racial domination can only appear as external or alien to America's ethical and political life, rather than being those parts of the richness and complexity of that life trying to win the day. And this remains, I insist, a defining insight of Douglas's thinking. But Douglas does not merely see America as the object of his faith, whereas Delaney decides to do otherwise. Douglas is not trying to offer a different historical narrative to combat Delaney's. Rather, Douglas sees the full meaning of American democracy as exceeding the facts to which we can readily appeal. And it exceeds the facts because the underlying logic of political society carries with it a principle of openness, a principle that renders who comprises the polity as a contested category. So this emphasis on remaking and reinventing and openness in the service of the future that I emphasize in Douglas may give the impression that he means for us to turn from the past. And if I've given you that impression, I apologize. Douglas thinks too much about the past and he agonizes over it. Douglas does not mean for us to break with history, rather, to appropriate James Baldwin's words, he wants us to enter into battle with it, with ourselves. He wants us to recreate ourselves according to a principle more humane and more liberating. And in doing so, we may just achieve a level of personal maturity and freedom which robs history of its tyrannical power and also changes the history we come to live. We struggle to live together as democratic citizens because we have not always understood the art of allowing portions of ourselves to die. What Douglas and Baldwin share is the belief that a democratic society is partly measured by the ability of its citizens to let go of their former selves as they quest for larger and more inclusive selves. We hear from all political corners that the sun is setting on the American empire. And this is as it should be. Every empire that has existed has left death and destruction in its wake. But what we must ask ourselves now, the question that Douglas put to his fellows in his own time, is what in our past might we retrieve for our present? How might those resources be reimagined to articulate a political faith more humane and just than the reality we find ourselves living? And how might we allow portions of ourselves to die with grace so that we might live and grow with dignity? But answering this question, or answering these questions, requires us to begin as Douglas did, with the idea that who we are as Americans need not determine who we may become. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Professor Rogers. Because you can't hear applause that would normally take place at this point, let me just, on behalf of the faculty and staff and students at Knox, thank you for your lecture and for your time with us today. And what I want to do now is just open this time up for questions and to dialogue with you. And so, as I said at the beginning, you can either raise your hand and I can unmute you, or you can also, if you would prefer, type a question through the Q&A box or through the chat. We don't really know which way works best, as this is the first virtual event that we've done, and Professor Rogers said it's the same for him. And so whichever way you feel comfortable, we'd like to take Professor Rogers will take your questions. I'll try and monitor this. So if you raise your hand, just keep it raised, and then I can see you. I'll watch the Q&A too.
I guess we're all in agreement.
Here we go. We have a question here. How do you see the two opposing views you described fleshing out in contemporary activist moments?
Right. That's a great question. So, so there's a sort of practical side to this, and then there's a kind of intellectual side to this. I think the practical side to this is that I don't actually think that these two moments are playing themselves out. In other words, I think that the contemporary moments, you know, particularly with the movement for Black Lives, I think that they stand very much close to Douglas, even as they are engaged in yet another and new reconfiguration of how we might organize ourselves as it relates to policing, as it relates to the sort of workings of sort of capitalism and extraction and expropriation, these kinds of things. But I think on the intellectual side, I think that there is a robust defense intellectually and a sort of resurgence of the idea that is more akin to this early version of Delaney in 1852, in which anti-Blackness is at the core of American life, and that then requires not that one participate in politics, but rather that one retreats from it as a way to to secure some semblance of sort of protection for oneself. It's not clear how that could work, but that's how I sort of see it sort of fleshing itself out. I think that the activists on the ground, by virtue of their very activism, is in essence saying damn pessimism, right?
Okay, we have two questions in the Q&A. One is from Danielle Fatkin, who says, thank you for this inspiring lecture, and then asks, are there any models for after empire that you would like us to consider?
No, I don't know that. I mean, I don't know that I don't know that I have, models. My sense is that, once again, what you see in the movement for Black Lives is an attempt to sort of cultivate an ethic of care and to use that as the basis for organizing our relationship to each other, right? I mean, that is really, that's one of the sort of things that is partly being exposed by police brutality. But this just simply reveals that Black and brown bodies are not the subjects of care. And since they're not the subjects of care, you can dispense with them however you see fit. But I don't know that I have a model, because one doesn't want to overdetermine the very process that you hope the people will bring into existence.
Okay, we've got several more good questions. One is, how does one become hopeful or full of faith? Can it be taught? Is it rooted in dialogue? How does it happen that a person embraces hope or faith as a way of being in the world?
I mean, that's a very good question. I think, Douglas in his narrative of 1845. I mean, he has a story about the way the kind of sort of counseling spirit of God fortified his soul and moved him forward. So kind of one story where it has a kind of religious character to it. But W.B. Du Bois, right, the figure with whom I began, if you go to his Souls of Black Folk of 1903, he provides this sort of wonderful story, of course, that is laced with tragedy throughout, of the great Black nationalist Alexander Crummell. And one wonders, by the time you get to the end of that story, which it seems that Crummell's life that he's failed, one wonders, why is that story on display? And one of the things that I think is interesting about this is that story is on display because Du Bois means for his Black readers to see in Crummell's life performance value, even in the face of his disappointment. And that one could use performance value, that one gave it one's all, and that the failure is not a function of one's abilities, character, or will, but it's a function of the socio-institutional ecology. But to see the performance value of Crummell life, even amid failure, as in some ways a stimulant for their own reason to hope, right, in their own lives, right? And so sometimes there's a religious study, and sometimes there are models that we deploy as a way to sort of fortify us and to sort of give us a sense of hope. But in truth, there's also just simply the basic feature of what it means to be a human being, desiring and questing after a life that we could properly call a good one.
All right, we actually have someone who's raising their hand, so I'm going to unmute Annalisa Gomez. And Annalisa, you are now unmuted, so you can ask your question.
Oh, okay, thank you. Well, because you mentioned W.E.B. Du Bois often, and he was someone who was very hopeful and had a lot of faith in our society for a while, and then ended up moving out of the United States at one point, because I think he said he kind of gave up on the notion that Black people in America could truly be equal. So how do we reconcile that pessimism that is so easily to be entrenched, especially in this day and age where, I mean, now there is like a resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, but it's against this backdrop of a Trump America and still a very racist society that kind of also has had a resurgence because of Trump's presidency.
Right. So you are absolutely right. And thank you for bringing that up. The 1860s, Du Bois, reportedly remarks that he's leaving. He really can't take this country. He's leaving, and he sets no date for return. Chin up and struggle on. I don't think I got the quote exactly right, but chin up and struggle on. But know that there basically is no hope for the American Negro. I think it's important that he says American Negro, or that America is in that, because he thinks that there are other places where one can go and other possibilities. You're absolutely right. So this is the Du Bois that has lived so long, and now at the end of his life, seeing a country that has refused to be transformed by his and others' appeal and struggle, and so he gives up. And yet the irony of this, and when we say give up, we mean with respect to the United States. And yet the irony of it is that there's no way to imagine the civil rights movement without Du Bois. At the very moment that Du Bois is no longer here, and right as he dies, right, we have the march on Washington for jobs and freedom, and that's only possible because of what Du Bois and others, the ground that they had laid. And so the question is, should that not count for something? I count for it all, right? But the point is that if we get away from trying to hit upon the true and real story of America, if we turn away from that and turn away to the doings and the struggles, the progress as well as the backslides, what we come to see is that what this nation is about is fundamentally a contested story. And it may be that it might be contested all the way to the end, right?
I think we have an opportunity to combine two questions, to put them both on the table at the same time. Izzy Scott asks, do you believe that faith is the most efficient way to bring lasting change to this country? If faith depends on the attitudes of people we cannot control, how can it be used to its fullest potential?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a good question, because if the aspirational idea of the people, a people not yet, if that aspirational idea is actually central to what legitimizes America, right? What is the companion dispositional orientation? And the companion dispositional orientation, I would suggest to you, is faith, right? Now, to say that that's the companion dispositional orientation is not yet to say anything about the substance of the faith or the mode of execution, right? That's the next step in the story about faith. So faith alone as an articulation of one's vision of what America can be is not by itself going to do the trick. Now the question is, right, so what's the mode of executing and realizing that faith, right? And of course, one of the things that this question hits upon is a danger here that looms over the faith holders. And the danger is that your fellows may turn to you and say no. That is to say no to the vision that you're offering up. And yet, Douglas is insistent that there's no way of bringing about transformation without courting that danger. And I mean, I would go on to say actually that although this particular danger is dramatized and more intensified in the case of Black life. But this actually, the story of faith is a feature of democratic life as such, in which we are always engaged in dealing with those over whom we exercise no control, and yet we depend on them for realizing the political goods that will help us flourish.
A similar kind of a question, I think. Alex P.S. says, I was especially struck with your last statement about us needing to let something from our past to die so that we can live more fully in the future. And his question is, what ideas do you have for how we are to go about letting something of our past die?
One of the questions, I know we're on Zoom, I should be looking forward, I'm looking all up here. So I apologize, I'll get better at this. One of the things that folks like Douglas, and let's say much later on James Baldwin, was trying to get us to think about was the enabling or disenabling qualities that we attach to, that we think are part of our identity. And how do those elements actually frustrate our attempt to live in a just society? Sometimes our religious commitments can do that. Sometimes claims about racial identification can do that. Whiteness, for someone like James Baldwin, functions in this way. It sort of renders us white Americans blind to their complicity in the suffering of others. And someone like Douglas was presupposing that he was dealing with folks who were trying to be in a better relationship with themselves in the American polity, right? And he also presupposed that he was dealing with folks who could be shaken out of their moral blindness, right? And armed with this idea that some were trying to get in right relationship with what it means to live in a just society, others were open to being shaken, that this could be the basis for beginning the process of letting something go while you quest after something else. How might what you are holding on to get in the way of you being responsive to the world around you? Right? And what someone like Douglas was trying to do was to shame and ridicule his audience in various ways, to see that they have to let something go. James Baldwin, for example, was trying to do a similar thing in his work. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Kind of a different route. Do you think Delaney's pessimistic views about American anti-Blackness influenced Justice Clarence Thomas's political philosophy?
No, you read Corey Robin's book. I have no reason to believe that Delaney's views influenced him, although, or let me just qualify it. Delaney's views coming down through time, modified, not always referenced to Delaney, taken up by someone like Malcolm X in the Nation of Islam, perhaps. But you should go read Corey Robin's book on Clarence Thomas, which is pretty spot on about this.
We have a question from Luis Barrero. In regard to Baldwin and/or Douglas's insight into the tyrannical tendencies of history, must we today confront or configure ourselves and look at our history as individuals or as factions separated by race or ideology, for example, or as contemporary American generations as a whole? Considering the truth that a large number of this contemporary was not intended to be included. Basically, how must we confront history today while trying to lose it ourselves in order to live with each other?
Oh boy, I don't know if I caught, I don't know, Tom, I should have stopped you because I don't know if I was following that question. Tom, can
you see it in the Q&A if you pull that up? And then it's down a little bit.
Oh, I see, okay, hold on.
So it's Luis Barrero at 5.
Oh, I see. We'll go to Baldwin or Douglas. Today, must we today confront or configure ourselves? So I think that, let me see if I got this right. So look, I think that part of what's, someone like Douglas, but especially someone like Baldwin, who I didn't present on tonight, but let's talk about Baldwin for a moment, is very much concerned about the stories that we tell ourselves and the way in which the stories that we tell ourselves work to absolve us of our responsibility in creating horror for other human beings, right? Or sort of creating hell for other human beings, right? And part of what both Douglas, but especially Baldwin, was interested in was trying to sort of shake us into acknowledging this, right? And for Baldwin, Baldwin thought that there were bad stories about Black identity that Black folks deploy. Now, there's a reason for why there might be bad stories. The bad stories are necessary in some instances to fortify one's existential soul against the onslaught of white supremacy, but they may be bad stories nonetheless that we too have to disabuse ourselves of. But really what the ethic that is being communicated, what the norm that is being communicated from both Douglas and Baldwin, is using the principle of openness as the very grounds of one's identity. And using that principle of openness as one confronts a society that is making claims on you, a society in which you, because you use this principle of openness, you're now positioned to be more responsive, more perceptive to the pain of your fellows. That somehow you seem unable to respond to appropriately because of the various myths that you use to organize your identity and to organize your understanding of American society as such, right? So the myth, for example, right, the sort of myth of individualism and the notion that there's a one-to-one correspondence between effort and outcome, and that is possible because the context is there for you to deploy your effort to achieve your outcomes. And then if you don't achieve your outcomes, given that the opportunity is there, it must have something to do with you, right? But in the context of a society of massive economic inequality, where the racial divide is pronounced, in which you see folks of color sitting on the sort of lower rung of life in relation to their white counterparts, you have to ask the question: how is this that this has happened? And one of the things that you quickly come to discover, if you're open to dealing with that question, is that more often than not, right, this is a function of how American society is organized, and not a function of people's will or character, right? But because of the myth, right? And so it gets in the way of us looking at this, right?
All right, one more question we have here is from Daniel Bien. He says, whenever I hear Du Bois, he thinks of Booker T. Washington. Listening to Black and brown statesmen is more important than ever. However, Booker T. Washington believes Blacks have to work to earn their place in society. How does one respond to Washington's moderate stance on fixing systemic oppression and racism in America? Although he is a person of color, he inherently puts the burden on Black folks to prove to white America that they are worthy.
Yeah. I mean, this is a sort of classic, important question, and a sort of classic one. Obviously, someone like Du Bois' criticism of Booker T. Washington was that he was conceding ground at precisely the moment in which he needed to encourage the assertiveness of Black people. That if the hallmark of our understanding of freedom is that you will fight for it against the forces of domination, even if you were on, even if it appeared that you were going to be on the losing end, you would fight nonetheless, because freedom is the hallmark of what it means to be a human being. The thought was by Du Bois that Booker T. Washington effectively conceded ground on this. And by not being interested in this kind of sort of classical, more standard way of thinking about Booker T. Washington, standard way, and in not pressing for full civic equality, Booker T. Washington essentially affirmed the very things that were said about Black people, that in fact they're not fit for freedom, because here they are, they don't want to fight for it. Now Booker T. Washington is a bit more complicated than that. Du Bois flattens him out. He has a sort of richer story about how we engage in resistance. He has a story about political economy and its centrality to American life. And so by pushing Black folks to work and build, he is thinking that they could be the sort of foundation for the economic system of American life. And if they become the foundation of it, then their freedoms would quickly follow thereafter. You also might think that there's actually a kind of subtle pessimism to Washington, in part because he actually never quite believed that white Americans would be transformed in the right kind of way. And thus it made a good deal of sense that Black folks would build themselves up economically and try to fortify themselves. And of course, that kind of idea of Booker T. Washington would be appropriated in various ways by another Black nationalist, and perhaps one of the most important Black nationalists, probably second only to Martin Delaney, Marcus Garvey of the 1920s. And depending on your temperament, if you're really a big institutionalist, big into social movements, you might think, no, Marcus Garvey was actually more important because of the movement that he led. But Marcus Garvey thought that there was something to what Booker T. Washington was saying. So the seemingly conservatism of Washington opens up to a kind of radicalism in someone like Marcus Garvey.
Thank you. Well, that appears to be all the questions, and we've come right up to 5:30 and even a little past. So I want to again thank you, Professor Rogers, on behalf of Knox College, our faculty and staff, and all of our students, for taking the time to join us today. And as I said to you privately, our only regret is that we couldn't welcome you in person to our campus, though of course we hope that we can do that at some point in the future. So thank you so much for joining us. And that's the end of our event. And someone asked if this will be made, the recording of this lecture will be made available. And the answer is yes, and hopefully very soon. I don't know exactly when, but hopefully sometime this week that will be posted.
Well, I just want to say thank you to all of you for attending and for showing up and for bearing with me as I work through the lecture and my thinking on this, which is not settled. But I hope that I provided you with something that you can continue to sort of think about and discuss amongst yourselves. And I hope in the course of talking, a whole series of names and figures emerged that you now want to go read about and study. And so, Tom, I want to thank you again for inviting me. This has been this is different, but it's nonetheless it's been very nice. So thank you.
Yes, of course, we're glad to have had you.